Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on what's up for UNEP banks in 2020. We see that people are still coming onto the system. It usually takes people a couple of minutes longer than they expected. So I hope it's okay for all of you if we start about 3 minutes past the hour to make sure that we can have as many people with us from the start as possible. Thanks very much for your patience. Once again, good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the line. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on what's up for UNEP banks in 2020. To those of you we haven't spoken to yet in this year, happy, healthy, and I hope successful new year to all of you. 2019 has been a big year for banks here at UNEP with the launch of the Principles for Responsible Banking in September, with over a third of the global banking industry. UNEP member banks really have given themselves and the global banking industry a new framework that aligns banks with society's goals. We've reached over 160 signatories by now, and the numbers are growing. In general, over 2019, we've grown our banking membership by over 50%. So special welcome to all of the banks that are still relatively new to UNEP. I think for many of you, this is going to be the first time you really get a full overview of everything that's going on for banks here at UNEP. By signing the Principles for Responsible Banking, our banks have committed to strategically align their business with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals, and really to massively scale up their contribution to the achievement of both. Key mechanisms here are, of course, target setting in the areas of most significant impact and impact analysis, and of course, accountability, transparency through reporting. So that's quite an ambitious agenda and commitment to implement. And of course, this is a community of banks that works towards doing that together and by supporting each other and by pushing the envelope together. And so today we really want to look at ongoing and new projects, initiatives, activities at UNEP FI that will help all of you to implement the principles for responsible banking, or even if your bank is not a signatory yet, to really substantially advance on your sustainable banking practices. You will see there is going to be a working group structure that is very specifically catering towards implementing key mechanisms of the principles. But way beyond that, we have a quite impressive spectrum of different projects and initiatives that are quite relevant for all banks in implementing the principles for responsible banking and in increasing the sustainability of their business and their contribution to society. So with that, let me go through today's agenda. We will start with a presentation by my colleague Puleng, who will give you an idea of what the working group structure for supporting the implementation of the principles for responsible banking will probably look like. Then we'll move to impact, and this will once again be Puleng. This morning we had Karine talking about the working groups and projects that are going on there. We'll move after that to climate with our climate team lead Remco Fischer and his colleagues Paul Smith and David Carlin, who will talk about the various projects and initiatives for you under climate. Afterwards, we will move on to ecosystems. Our colleague Liesel Bonast will give you an idea of what very interesting projects are coming up where we really want to work for you and with you on biodiversity. After that, we'll move into a couple of Europe-specific projects. Of course, Europe, very dynamic space, especially also with the European Commission and European policymakers moving ahead. Finally, we'll have a quick look at flagship events coming up, quite important, mark your calendars, and of course, training last but not least. Through all of this, it's very important that you come in, ask questions, and interact. You've all received the overview in writing of what's up for UNEP FI banks in 2020. So today is really the opportunity to, beyond that, engage with our various experts and team leads and ask all the questions you have, make comments, and really get in a good position to be able to pick and choose what projects and working groups suit your needs, interests, and priorities best, and where you want to participate. In order to facilitate that, we will have a Q&A section after every single one of those segments. So you can, right after you heard on one area, ask all your questions to the respective experts and get into a dialogue. How do you do that? There are two ways to raise your questions. One is the questions box, which you should see on your interactive panel. So you can just type your questions in. You can do that at any point, and then we'll read them out at the end of the segment. Or if you'd like to speak directly, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand button, and then we'll unmute you and you can make your comment or question directly. So with that, and without much further ado, let us go to our first presentation by Puleng on implementing the principles for responsible banking. Puleng, over to you. Puleng, we can't hear you speaking.
Thank you very much, Simone. I'm sure that's better. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who has joined this webinar. We do have a lot to get through, so I'm going to try to move through these slides fairly quickly to give all of my colleagues an opportunity to also get through theirs. Simone, can we please go to the first slide? So I will be walking you through the proposed implementation structure for the Principles for Responsible Banking. This first slide really gives an idea of where we are going. We had asked banks, signatory banks, to complete a gaps and needs analysis. We received these from 90 banks, and really the overwhelming areas where support is being requested are these bullet points that you can see on the slide. This is what I'm going to show you next is proposed, because we still need to engage in conversation with the core group, which is the group of 30 banks that developed the principles. Simone, please can we go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so in terms of the working groups that we are proposing to move forward with, the first one would be called the Communications and Knowledge Sharing Working Group, and what the task of this working group would be really to try and develop work packages or information packages and videos that really break down what the requirements for the principles are. And the purpose of this is just to make sure that there's a common understanding across all signatories with regards to what the requirements are. And it'll also make it easier for colleagues from banks who are working closely with us on the principles to be able to then relate what the requirements are internally. This working group will also be responsible for when other working groups that we'll discuss just now, develop approaches, they would then be responsible for, again, packaging those in more digestible ways and then sharing them. Their third function would be to coordinate external communications and campaign strategies around principles implementation. You'll see at the bottom of each working group that there's a profile. That profile gives an indication of what the criteria is for involvement. And maybe just to take a step back to say that all of these working groups that we want to develop, they would be led, and then participants would also come from signatories to the principles. And you'll see at the end of my presentation, I'll basically discuss how banks get involved with that. Second working group is around impact. And here, most of you would be aware that we have an impact working group at the moment that is developing a tool for portfolio impact analysis. So this working group here would follow on from that and effectively would be responsible for training other banks on how that tool works. Obviously, banks that are new would then also learn how that tool works, and then go into testing the tool. Come back to the working group with feedback, competition issues noted around, what were the results of that, and, how do we interpret these results. And a third layer would then be to feedback on, are there areas where we can enrich or improve the tool. The last working group on this particular page, still falling under impact, would then follow from that work by identifying, where are there still gaps with impact analysis that we need to address, and then to work on those. You can go to the next slide, Simone. The next working group would be looking at target setting. And here we've got 3 streams within that. The first 2 are really, the participants would be banks that have committed to the climate commitment on the collective commitment on climate action. The first stream would really involve learning from and applying existing methodologies and experiences. The second would then be tasked with developing common standards and guidance for comparable target setting, progress monitoring, and reporting. We then move on to the next working group that still falls within target setting, and this is the work of this working group would then be to develop indicators, metrics, and methodologies for target setting in areas that are outside of climate. And so, some of these areas maybe biodiversity, gender, or decent employment. How will we identify which ones to start with? What we are going to attempt to do is to see in what areas are coming up following impact analysis as being those of most significant impact for most banks, and we'll start with those. All right. Then moving on to working group number 4, reporting and assurance. Here, there's also 2 aspects. The first aspect is a number of those banks within the working group will come together and they'll engage with assurers to basically develop criteria that assurers can then use when they assure a self-assessment that's been completed by a bank. So that's the one function. The other function is to create a platform where banks that are embarking on reporting now can basically engage with each other, share ideas, share approaches for how it is that they're thinking about approaching their reporting, and out of that, over time, I think we will be able to then get some approaches that we can share more broadly with other banks, so they can learn from the work that happens in that platform. We can go to the next slide. Next working group will focus on peer learning. And the areas that have been identified for peer learning based on the results of the gaps and needs analysis are really, how do banks work with clients and customers towards target setting or to more fair customer outcomes? How do they develop strategies and stakeholder engagement as well? So those are kind of the 3 that have been earmarked already for peer learning. The next working group will be looking at progress monitoring and evaluation. The task here is for them to define what successful implementation of the principles looks like at the collective level, and what indicators and metrics can be used to measure progress, and to monitor, and so on and so forth. So that's that one, and then let us move on, Simone, to the timeline. So in terms of the timeline for how all of this will unravel, for signatories, by mid-March, we'll be sharing a final implementation structure with signatories. We'll also at the same time issue a call for signatories to basically put themselves forward to either lead a specific working group or to participate in a specific working group. By mid-April, what we would have done is to have gone through all of the feedback that we received from signatories with regards to which working group they want to be involved in. We'll then get in touch with the working group leads as well as participants. We'll set up calls, kickoff calls for all of the working groups, and those kickoff calls will begin at the beginning of May. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Mauro, I think you would then step in, and then we'll open for questions. Is that correct, Simone?
Yes, thank you very much for that overview, Pulang, of what the current thinking is, and of course that still needs to be confirmed. We do also want to give you a little bit of an idea of, how this global structure will be also broken down to the regions, and how regionally specific topics and priorities be incorporated in that. And for that, we have with us our Latin American Regional Coordinator, Maria Eugenia. And Mauro, over to you.
Thank you, Simone. Hello to everyone. So we are going to have a specific implementation for Latin America and Caribbean. Our idea is to support our members and signatories with additional materials, contents. Our base is the guidance document, and we will use the experience of the regional banks to generate new content for beginners, advanced, small, and big banks, considering the particularities we have here in Latin America. We already have funds for April and June. And I hope we can have additional funds for the second semester. And we will always have a webinar to launch our content, and then we will have videos and a PowerPoint with additional content. We will have these documents in Portuguese and in Spanish, and an advisory group. They are part of the core group to help us to select what are the best practice in the region, and it will be interesting to share with everyone. And this is the structure we have. So for April, we hope to launch in April. So what are the relevant frameworks, governance and culture? In June, about impact analysis. In the third quarter, about how to engage our clients. And finally, engagement and accountability. So we also will learn together, and we hope that the experience could be implemented in the future for other regions, and we will learn with each other. So that's it. I hand to you, Simone.
Thank you very much, Maria Eugenia. That's the spirit. And let's go to questions now from our participants. And please, to everyone, while we're dealing with the first few, do type away or raise your hands. This is your chance to ask questions, and also, just to clarify if something's not clear to you, you can be sure there are 10 other people in this call to whom it's not clear either. So really go ahead and ask. Let's get started here. This is just a comment of approval, Maro. Materials in our own languages will be very useful. Thank you very much, Maria Eugenia. That is certainly true. Do we have further questions for the moment? Let me also check if we have some raised hands. We've had very, very lively participation this morning. So please let us make the same this afternoon. Let's clarify everything. Let's make sure you all understand how the various activities can benefit you and how you can participate. Okay, I think for the moment people seem to be clear. So let us go to the next section for the moment. If you still come up with questions for this section, maybe Fuleng and Maro will stay with us for another 10-15 minutes, but they will also leave at some point. So if you have questions around the implementation working groups on the principles for responsible banking going forward, how to participate there, or if you have questions with regards to the regional approach, now's the time. Okay, so for the moment not, which is fine. Time to warm up a little bit still. Let's go, here we go. Thanks for taking the first step here. In Latin America, there is not data about climate impact in the portfolios of financial systems. What will we do in this case? That's a deep dive question. Maro, I don't know, do you feel comfortable answering, or should we bring in the climate team here?
I think we can talk with the climate team too, but I think we will launch. We made a survey about climate risks in the region. We will launch this survey in the next, maybe in April or March. So that will give us an overview of the region, and maybe that can help us for the next steps, specifically for climate change.
Fantastic. Maybe also a comment from my side. I'm not sure from which bank this comes, but there are quite a number of Latin American banks that are signatories to the collective commitment to climate action, and so really have committed to tackling this issue of climate change and climate change impact in their portfolios. So I think a lot of experience and preliminary answers to this challenge can maybe be found also among some of the peers who are showing their leadership by joining this collective commitment. Okay, I think then for now, let's move on to our second area, which is impact. Puleng, for that, I hand back to you.
Thanks, Simone, and thanks, Mara. All right, so most of you would be aware that we have had 2 working groups on impact analysis that have been doing work over the past few months, almost a year actually. I've already alluded to the one, but maybe let me go into a little bit of detail on both of them. So the one tool is the banking portfolio tool. This is the what we sometimes refer to as the impact identification tool. And here what we're talking about is a tool that will guide banks with their impact analysis at the portfolio level. So that will entail looking at the business areas that a bank is involved in, the various sectors and industry activities within those business areas, and then the geographies that a bank operates in, and that would obviously be overlaid then with the context that a bank operates in. And all of this then would help a bank get a sense of what are the biggest impacts that are derived or associated with my portfolio, and then which ones do I really need to pay a lot of attention to. So effectively what we're saying is which ones are of most significance, and that then basically directs a bank as to where do I set my targets. So that's the one tool. The other tool is focused on corporate clients. And so this one focuses on individual clients, and a user or a bank can use this to get a pretty good idea of the impacts of specific clients, and also how clients are then attempting to manage or address those impacts, if at all. And what that then assists a bank or a user to do is to then make determinations around, firstly it can feed into how you set targets, right? Also considerations of how do I address these impacts that are coming through from the activities of my clients, and so associated to a bank basically and directly through finance and investments. And so does a bank then go and engage with these clients for the purposes of effectively going on a transition journey with these particular clients? Do we look for new investments and new clients, or is divestment something that the bank should be looking at? So those are really the 2 tools. I think I'll just go very quickly into how they work together. So the one tool, we like to say that the one tool is kind of a top-down and the other one is a bottom-up. And we say that because the one kind of looks, it kind of gives you an overview of what's happening in the portfolio, and the other one kind of is bottom up in the sense that then you can look at specific clients. So maybe you do the portfolio impact analysis, you get an understanding of where the most significant impacts are and the sectors that are associated with those, and then you can use the other tool to look very specifically at clients within those sectors or industry activities. So that's kind of how they work together. I hope that makes sense. Can we go to the next slide, Simone? All right, so in terms of timeline, we are currently wrapping up work on the prototypes, and we're going into a testing period on both tools next week. We have issued a number of calls to ask banks to, volunteer, come on board, join the working groups. This would really then be the last one for, these particular working groups that, their work is coming to an end. So as I said, we're going into testing. Following that testing period, we'll then, take all the input and feedback that we received, make amendments and adjustments to the tool, and then towards the end of March, we'll be launching the prototypes, with the understanding that there'll still be a lot of work that needs to be done. Hence, when I was talking about the impact working group that's going to be applying the portfolio tool, I had said that the working group that does that will also be tasked with providing feedback so that we can enrich the tool, and there'll be other engagements as well with various industry leaders as well, to basically then add more richness to the tool. So that's effectively the impact, the 2 impact working groups. I'll leave it there and open to questions. We can't hear you, Simone.
Thanks, Puleng. Should also press that unmute button. Thanks very much for your insights into those 2 tools on impact that are quite advanced, now going into the testing with banks, and where we'll have the prototypes being launched in March, and that I think will be highly useful to our member banks. I'm looking to see a few questions coming in on the impact work. So far, I do not see any. Let me also check if anybody is raising their hands. It's quite a difference to this morning.
Yeah.
Please don't be shy. I see here, Jaime, you're raising your hand. Let me unmute you. Jaime, good afternoon. I think maybe you had joined us already. We had spoken yesterday, but Jaime, good morning to Latin America. You should be able to speak now.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, our question is about the testing. How would it work? More or less, we are not sure if we are gonna want to participate yet. So we would like to know a bit more of how this testing would work. Would it be when can we see the tool? We don't even know if we would be able to implement it right away for a portfolio.
Okay, thank you very much, Jaime. Very good question. So, Puleng, a few more details on what the testing entails.
Okay, fantastic. So we go into testing next week. So kickoff for testing is on Monday next week. We have a period of 2 weeks for testing, and effectively what banks will be required to do is to effectively, really do their impact analysis using the tool. So go through all of the steps in the tool, and really what we're looking for are a number of things. First thing is we're looking for, the very first thing is, does the tool work properly as it's supposed to? Then there's an issue around the interpretation of the results. So you're going to get certain outputs, and the question is, are those outputs intuitive? Would you have expected those kinds of results? Do they make sense to you? How do we interpret these? So there's a lot of questions around that. There's a lot of aspects in the tool as well, where we'd be looking for feedback from banks so that, we can basically then, make amendments, incorporate various changes into the tool in order to make it as user-friendly as possible. So I think in a nutshell, that's really what testing is about. First round of testing will be over a 2-week period, which is sufficient for banks that have been in the working group for a certain amount of time, kind of understand how the tool works, and have already collected a lot of the data that will be required. You would have heard earlier on that I spoke about, banks need to, the analysis involves looking at what the main sectors or business areas are that a bank is involved in, that there's a country context aspect as well. So all of that requires data, requires interacting and finding the right colleagues internally who can help you with that. And it's also going to require quite a time commitment to be able to work through all of that. So that's, I think in a nutshell, what testing will be. And then to also just say that once we receive the results from banks, we would then need to go through that, make amendments to the tool, and then go into a shorter second period of testing, just then to make sure that all of that has been integrated, and that the tool is then in a position where it's ready to be released publicly.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it might be very interesting for us to see how the tool works and already get familiar with it. But I'm not sure if our managing of the data of our portfolio is ready so that we can have like actual results that represent our situation. Is it possible to do this testing? And if the case is needed, just put in data that might not be real, or just put some data in to see how it works? Would this be possible?
I think it is possible to do. What I do think is a better approach, because in order to really interpret the results that are coming out, it's better to kind of put in real data, right? Because that's when you kind of really get a sense of is what's coming out of the tool really reflective of what's happening. And also there's a very important aspect around how those results are interpreted, right? So what I would suggest is, and for new banks, I think it may take longer than 2 weeks, but I mean, I think we can facilitate that, allow a longer period for banks that are coming on board, although maybe you just do one round of testing. But I do think it's better to use the data that is available to you to do the testing, so that you can really get a sense of the results that are coming out and what they mean for you. So does that kind of cover your question? And also then to just say that we have scheduled a call for tomorrow with some banks that are new joiners to the working group. So if you want to join that, and we'll basically be presenting the tool, you'd be more than welcome to do that. You can just email Karina and myself. Our email addresses are on the screen, and we can include you in that calendar invite. I think it's tomorrow at 2 p.m. CET. Otherwise, we'll hold a further call for banks that can't make that.
Carmen, did you get that? I'm not sure how well Pulling's audio arrives over with you, but she encouraged you to join a call tomorrow afternoon,
Yes.
our time, morning your time, where they present the tool in detail, so you can have a look and get a more detailed idea of what data would need to go in there, etc. If you send an email to the email addresses that are on the screen here, then we'll send you the invite. Does that work?
Yes, perfect. We would definitely be interested in joining tomorrow to see, to have a better look of how this would work and the data that would be needed.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Then I have another hand raised here, equally in Latin America, I think. I'm judging from the name here. Gilberto, I have unmuted you. You should be able to speak. Okay, Gilberto, we don't hear anything yet. It's Gilberto Nascimento. Now we can hear you. Fantastic.
You hear me? Okay. Yeah, glad to meet you. Just curiosity, or by means of inquiry, I didn't heard about that, but will this framework will it be related at some point to other frameworks underway by, for instance, the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund? At some point, I mean, I guess there are other works going in somehow related to this structuring of the PRB, and is it forecast, predict to happen at some point? I don't know if it is clear.
Not too clear, but is the question whether we will be, when we talk about engaging with external stakeholders in terms of building on the tool, just holding engagements to enrich the tool, are you talking about that, or are you talking about PRB in general?
Didn't hear you very well, but I'm talking about crossing or relating to what other institutions are doing in the same sense,
Okay,
related to PRB, just to have some time of some way of crossing and getting synergy on this work.
Okay, so this sounds, Simone, more like a PRB in general question as opposed to an impact-specific question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Gilberto, of course. I think there is lots of collaboration to be had on various aspects. think the impact one is one area, and there are of course other initiatives also at the World Bank, specifically the IFC, etc., which Karine and Puleng are already engaged with. When we look, for example, at target setting in the climate space, there are plenty of actors out there already involved in that, be that the Science Based Targets Initiative, be that groups around carbon accounting, or around setting science-based targets on a sector-specific basis, etc. So yes, I mean, we're very much in touch with the various stakeholders and other international organizations on the various topics, and try to coordinate as much as possible and use synergy as much as possible. I mean, also because, many banks are part of various initiatives and very much favor that kind of coordination so they don't do double work in different parts. Does that answer your question, Roberto?
Yes, that is. I think it's very, very strategic to have this in view, having these relationships during the development of this work. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for raising that, Gilberto. We have a question here from somebody asking us if we can send the slides of this meeting. Normally, you should have received the slide deck yesterday if you were already registered in the first half of the day. But if not, don't worry. We will also once again send the slide deck in a follow-up to the call today. So you'll receive it once again. So no worries about that. For the moment, Puleng, I don't see other questions, and I don't think I see any raised hands. So I'd say with that, thank you very much. And let's move on to our colleagues from the climate team, starting with our climate team lead, Remco Fischer.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Thanks. Thanks, Simone. Thanks, Puleng. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. This is Remco here. I'll just give a quick intro to parts of the climate work program that pertain to banks. And this slide here tells you the full story actually at the moment of our climate change work stream at UNEP FI. You can see obviously it transcends the three financial industries: banking, insurance, and investment. And what we do here is basically we support our members to work individually, collaboratively, to respond to what are probably at the moment the most prominent, the most important, the most influential climate-related frameworks out there, and to respond to the actual mandates that these frameworks give to the financial industry. So unsurprisingly, first you have the TCFD. Many of you will know we've been facilitating at UNEP FI the development of forward-looking scenario-based climate risk assessment methodologies for financial institutions for a number of years yet. The banks were quite pioneering on that front. They established the first TCFD pilot group already back in 2017. All of this work across the industries transcends also the transitional decarbonization related risks of climate change, as well as the physical, the meteorological, hydrological risks of climate change. There are TCFD groups at the moment for each industry. Specifically for banks, there are 40 banks collaborating on this, and you'll hear more about that from my colleague David Carlin in a minute. Now, the TCFD is a framework to ensure the resilience of the finance sector in light of climate change, or the resilience of financial institutions in light of climate change. It's not necessarily a framework to turn financial institutions into agents to help implement and deliver climate action. That's not what the TCFD calls for. That's what the Paris Agreement calls for. And obviously the Paris Agreement, this is the second line here, is a UN construct, and as such, UNEP FI we're responding to that in two ways. I would say, firstly, we're creating platforms through which financial institutions can pledge to align their activities, business models, portfolios with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. First and foremost, of course, the objective of limiting the global mean temperature increase by the end of the century to no more than 2 degrees. And we're doing that for the banks through a platform called the Collective Commitment to Climate Action that has come out of the Principles for Responsible Banking. And for asset owners, we're doing that through a second platform called the Net Zero Asset Owner Coalition. But not only that, I think in addition to these platforms, we're also furthering the agenda, asking questions, documenting it, deepening it. And what we want to do in the next couple of months, among other things, is come up with a thought leadership piece in partnership with Climate Kick that provides answers to a number of these questions. What are we talking about? Portfolio alignment, what is that? How can you achieve that? How is that different from risk, opportunity, impact? What are the metrics and approaches, etc.? And my colleague Paul will say something about that in a minute. And lastly, adaptation to the physical impacts of climate change is probably the area that is least understood at the moment when it comes to the finance sector and to what it is that the finance sector can do. So in response to that, UNEP has a collaboration with the Global Commission on Adaptation and the Global Center on Adaptation, and also my colleague Paul will talk about that in a minute. Let me just move over to the Collective Commitment to Climate Action, which is our banking effort focused on the Paris Agreement. So, one of those intersections that I mentioned in my previous slide, the mobilization of banks here under the responsible banking principles has been tremendous. Only in 6 months, 36 banks have signed up with 17 trillion in assets. And the commitment is pretty convincing. There's a commitment to within 3 years of signing for each of the banks in this group to be setting a portfolio level, sector-specific, science-based decarbonization target that is consistent with a well below 2 degrees temperature outcome. There's a commitment to, in the meantime, within 12 months of signing, coming up with a set of interim measures to help clients transition their business models. And there's a commitment to being publicly accountable to all of this and the ensuing impacts, etc. More information can be found obviously on our website, and people can get in touch with Simone from the banking membership if they want more information. Let me stop for now and hand the floor perhaps to David on the TCFD work that he's leading on at the moment. David?
Thanks, Remco. So I know we have a lot to get through, so to be relatively quick, for those of you who aren't as familiar with our TCFD work, the vision of the program is to really expand the toolkit that banks have when assessing and disclosing climate-related risks. And so we think about those risks in 2 ways, both the transition risks, which are posed by the changes in policies, changes in economic practices, and technology drivers that result in risk to the underlying portfolios that institutions hold, as well as, on the other hand, the physical risks, the actual incremental and extreme events that are likely to negatively impact assets and potentially disrupt business and economic functioning. And so within this program, we're fortunate to have a large group of nearly 40 institutions from 6 continents. And the work really is proceeding in 2 separate streams, one on transition and one on physical risk. The work on transition risk aims to first provide a deep understanding of the universe of climate risk scenarios that exist. So we're working with Cicero, as well as a couple leading climate modelers from the Potsdam Institute and IASA, a leading systems institute in Vienna, and looking at the latest of their projections and latest scenarios that they've provided. What we're doing with those is helping banks to develop the tools using not only the methodologies developed in the first phase of the pilot, but also extending these through the creation of heat maps and other assessment criteria. As you see, one of the things we'll deliver is a transition risk tool that is online and will be accessible to the membership. And then finally, thinking about how all of these pieces fit into better governance of the climate risk regime and how climate risk can impact strategic decision making, and how this can go from being a mostly regulatory and stress testing activity into a core part of how a business operates and how a financial institution selects its strategic opportunities. So if we move on to the next page, to physical risk, the view on the physical risk side, recognizing that this is a particularly location-specific and particularly data-heavy field, the vision here is really to provide a broad understanding, which will culminate in a blueprint on physical risk, looking at not only the data providers and data portals for extreme events in the present and future, but also looking at correlations between various physical risk events and bank assets, and also between those physical risk events and the macroeconomy. We'll also look at a series of physical risk heat maps built by third-party providers and think a bit about the opportunities that various changes in the physical landscape may create. So all of that to provide a game plan or a playbook for institutions to think about when you're assessing physical risk. How do you do this well? How do you do this comprehensively? I think if there's a theme in this work, it's really building comprehensive programs, building comprehensive approaches, and giving banks the tools not only to know and understand and assess, but also to disclose their current risks and commitments. And part of what we'll do at the end of the program to help in that is the construction of a UNEP TCFD or climate risk hub, intended to be a one-stop shop for the industry to look specifically at the various scenarios that have been put out, the various tools that have been facets of our program, as well as other regulatory and industry guidance around the TCFD and other climate risk topics. So that's from my side. I'll hand it back to you, Simone.
Thanks very much, Remco and David. Let's go to the third presentation on climate with our colleague Paul Smith. Paul?
Hi, Simone. Yep, this is Paul. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition, which builds very nicely on from David's last slide around physical risk. Now, this coalition is a commitment to disclose climate-related physical risk publicly within 2 years. So ignore the 2021 deadline there. If you're signing up this year, that would be within 2 years, and therefore 2022. This commitment really builds on the work that we carried out with the Global Commission on Adaptation last year, where we developed a technical background paper on adaptation finance. And one of the key findings from our paper was that it was very important to scale up the mainstreaming of the disclosure of climate-related physical risk as one of the key drivers to scaling up adaptation finance. So prior to the United Nations Secretary General's Climate Action Summit in September, we convened 5 financial institutions to form a leadership group on who committed to disclose climate-related physical risk. You can see the 5 financial institutions here, and they include 3 of our PRB banks, Rabobank, Standard Chartered, and Yes Bank. So what we are looking for from you is to join this commitment, because we really want to create a critical mass of financial institutions that are committing to public disclosure. Towards the end of the year, we have 2 key milestones, one of which is the Climate Adaptation Summit in Rotterdam in October of this year, and then, of course, COP26 in Glasgow in November. Just a few key elements around this commitment. As I've said, it's a commitment to disclose within 2 years of signature. It's not a technical forum. It very much builds on the TCFD pilot, particularly around physical risk that David was talking about earlier. There are no fees associated with this commitment, so it's very easy to join. And finally, it will provide a platform for discussion around adaptation finance. So we are developing right now a couple of articles that will be launched on our website. We're also preparing a webinar series, the first of which we held in December with guest speakers from Rabobank and from the Network for Greening the Financial System. We're also providing support to the Data Hub, which David briefly described, and we're also discussing with central banks about how physical risk will be integrated into guidelines and standards. So perhaps we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we are also partnering with Climate Kick, which is the Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community, which is an EU-funded initiative to bring public and private sectors together to tackle climate change through innovation and knowledge. And really the idea here is we are developing a paper in partnership with Climate Kick to crystallize the current thinking around climate change action by financial institutions. And really what we are aiming to outline here and provide a high-level thought piece is to describe the move from disclosure towards alignment and how leading financial institutions are increasingly willing to align their portfolios over time with the Paris Agreement. So this will establish our thinking and the philosophy behind this rapidly changing landscape of climate action. In practical terms, we've engaged two leading thinkers, Ben Caldecott from the University of Oxford and Dennis Pamlin from the Research Institutes of Sweden. And what we're looking for from PRB members, signatories, I should say, is the possibility of joining the review panel for this paper. So the review panel will consist of members from across the finance sector, including two banks, hopefully. And you have until the 3rd of February to express your interest in this. The work would involve reviewing at 3 stages this paper, kicking off in mid-February with a review of the outline of the paper, and then subsequently the first draft and the final draft. If you are not one of the 2 member banks that join the review panel, there will still be the opportunity to join a workshop towards the end of the development of the paper, where you will be able to review and discuss the paper before it's published in May. So that's all from me, Simone. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks a lot to our entire climate team. The 3 members that are on this call, there are more. So thanks a lot, Remco, David, and Paul. And let's get into a round of questions for our climate colleagues. And I have the first one here. David, it's with regards to the TCFD pilot. I read in the document you sent us, so that's the what's coming up for UNEP banks in 2020, that we must provide a financial contribution of $20,000 to join the TCFD working group. Could you give more details of what's included in that?
I mean,
yes, of course.
I can weigh in on this, David, because this is obviously a somewhat policy and budgetary decision made in preparation and in this design of the TCFD pilots. So all of the TCFD pilots that we have carried out at UNEP, starting with the phase 1 for banks 3 years ago, as I stated, but every other pilot have been self-funded by the financial institutions constituting each of these groups. And the rationale has always been that it would be ultimately, obviously, the full UNEP membership would benefit from this work, and the world's finance sector too, but most immediately would be the financial institutions participating immediately in this work and testing and piloting the methodologies and the approaches being brought forward via these pilots. So that's what explains, I think, the rationale for us raising project-specific fees. Does that answer most of the question at least.
I think it would be great to maybe, David, you can give also some indication of what deliverables, what kind of support, what kind of benefit banks can expect by joining the group.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So I think Remco gave a really good summary around the rationale and the premise. To provide a bit of detail on those points around the deliverables and the specific engagement. What you have within the program is the access to a variety of climate experts, both on the transition and physical side, that work with us not only to share the latest scenarios, ones that come from leading IPCC modelers, but also the latest approaches on physical and transition risk, usually in the form of tools that they specifically provide, giving access to program participants. You have support with those tools. You also have a variety of both plenary and regional events, not only to share information amongst your peers, but also to get industry perspectives on issues like regulation, as well as on the latest developments in climate risk. I would also say, as far as the particular deliverables, we'll be generating, as I mentioned, a transition risk web tool, a heat map, as well as papers outlining the climate scenario landscape, what effective climate risk governance looks like, and also the physical risk blueprint. So those are really some of the direct benefits. And then, of course, with with full-time staff deployed, or a full-time program manager deployed to this program, specific questions on an institutional level are also handled promptly. So if there are questions around your disclosures or your methodologies, we're always keen to take those up, as well as other climate topics of interest to the group.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Remco and David. I think that should answer the question. If not, please feel free to follow up with more details in the questions box. For the moment, I do not see any further raised hands or questions in the question box. So for now, once again, thanks a lot to the climate colleagues. And let's move on to our ecosystems work. And with that, our colleague Liesel van Ast. Liesel.
Thanks, Simone. So in ecosystems, there's a lot going on this year. It is the super year of nature. There's a lot happening in the policy and science space. So the first project which I'll go into is one which we've already developed, a tool to help you understand how the sectors that you're financing actually depend on availability of natural assets, natural resources such as water, soil, and biodiversity ecosystems that sustain economic business activity. So the tool maps how these sectors depend on natural capital across 167 sectors. So you can see where is it potentially material, where are the greatest potential risks, in order to then, of course, look at how those might be mitigated. It's a web-based tool. You can access it already. It's online. On our website, you can find a link. And what we're doing this year is updating it, enhancing it to include impact. So it will also show how do sectors impact biodiversity and natural capital. So you've probably seen the science that came out last year showing that there's a real decline in natural capital, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, and so on. And a lot of the drivers for that are, of course, sectors such as agriculture and mining and so on. So the tool will be looking at both. You can see both sides of how the sectors depend on natural capital and also how they're having impacts on natural capital. That should be around April, May this year that enhancement is available, as well as including more water data, which is, of course, a key input into many production systems. You may be interested to see the Nature Risk Rising report, which was released in Davos, I think it was last week, or the last few weeks. It actually used this Encore tool to come out with the analysis that's reflected in the report, which shows that $44 trillion of economic of GDP is actually generated from sectors dependent on nature. And so you could also use the same tool to have a look at how it may be affecting sectors that you're exposed to through your portfolios. We'll be providing training on it. So if you think that you'd like to have that, just get in touch and we'll follow up with you. That's immediately available for you this year. We have funding and resources for that. Thanks. Next slide, thanks. So of course, what you do about it then is the next phase of the project. So we're looking at the moment at how you would go about setting targets as a bank in order to align your targets with the frameworks that are coming out from the policy side on biodiversity. So what this means is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is expected to be set in October at the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties, which is essentially the Paris Agreement for nature. And so that's going to be a key policy driver for the next decade and beyond. And so what we're looking at already is what are the sort of pathways and how do we try and translate this into finance sector indicators and metrics and target setting. Of course, it's very challenging and we're still in the development stage, but it's really looking at how do we follow on from what's been done in climate on target setting around the 1.5 degree target for limiting a temperature rise. So how do we try and apply that same framing on biodiversity ecosystems? The current draft of the agreement, which is due to be agreed in October, sets a target of no loss of biodiversity ecosystems by 2030. So that means within 10 years from now, there should be no further land use change from any sector whatsoever. And beyond that, 2050, that there should actually be an increase in land available for ecosystem biodiversity. So it's a real shift. So such as zero carbon, it would be zero land use change essentially to have no further ecosystem loss. So so we're looking at what does that mean in terms of what's happening on science-based target setting across these topics. How do we try and bring that to the finance sector? There's a lot happening in the business sector, of course, in the policy science areas. And so how do we bring that to make it applicable and usable by banks? We're scoping out the project at the moment. We're looking at what are the main sectors with impacts and dependencies and how do we develop something that you can use. It's very early stages and we'll be inviting you to test methodologies, approaches, but it's actually also critical at this stage to have your inputs into what you would like to see. So if, for example, you're a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Banking, you want to set targets on biodiversity ecosystems or the Sustainable Development Goals that relate to life on land, life below water, we could look at how can we try and frame this work and the tools and the methodologies being developed. This is all donor funded to support that target setting. We've already interviewed 19 of our members to get inputs and to try and inform the scope and the shape of the project design going forward. And so we'll be coming back to you with a webinar in March to discuss more what the next steps are, how you can get involved in more detail, coming up with terms of reference for a working group, because we're still very much in the early stages of looking at what's actually feasible for us to do in terms of supporting this target setting work. And we're working with UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center, as well as Global Canopy to develop this. So by the end of it, you should be able to understand how you could align your portfolios with targets, whether that would align with Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. Alongside this, we also have funding from the European Commission, which is supporting work on sustainable blue economy finance. What this is doing is really a sort of community of practice. So it's really a place for finding out what others are doing, what your peers are doing around financing sustainable blue economy activity. What that means is financing shipping, ports, fishing, and other sectors that have a link to oceans, in order to look at how do you balance the economic activities with marine ecosystems being more stable, to help support SDG 14, which is life below water. So it's sharing knowledge, expertise also with others in the space, so people from science and from marine biology and other areas, so that we can really look at cross-industry fertilization and knowledge sharing to help accelerate the role of financing in helping to protect, align economic activity with protection of marine ecosystems. We also are planning to develop guidance, so to look at what's existing market practice, what are potential developments, how can you put this into practice in your own bank. And we'd be looking at what are others doing already, such as BNP Paribas, Credit Suisse, AXA are already stepping up action on the economy. You can see our partners. We're working with WWF, EIB, others on this. And we'd also be looking at bringing together the finance sector at the UN conference in June. There are also many policy decisions on marine protection that will be taken this year that, of course, down the line should be translated into policy regulation in the real economy by governments across the world. So we're looking at the UN Ocean Conference in June is one of those critical moments where we would like to give you the opportunity to also participate, share what you're doing, and learn from others as well. Next slide, please. This is our work on land use. I'm just highlighting one of the projects in this area, which is really available this year for you to get involved in. It's actually it's funded, donor funded, and it's therefore targeting specific countries. So it's really relevant to you if you have portfolio exposure in Paraguay, Indonesia, Liberia, Brazil. We'll have a training available for you later this year to really understand how you could deepen integration, how you could integrate land use, sustainable land use, into your environmental social risk management systems, into your ESG data, and that will be available the second half of this year. So if you're interested, please just get in touch with our colleague Jonathan Wilsons, or of course we can put you in touch with him. I think that's the main. Those are the main ecosystem projects. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Liesl, for this overview of the many exciting things that are going on in ecosystems, also very closely related to understanding impacts and based on that setting targets. So quite a lot of important work also for our Principles for Responsible Banking signatories and beyond. I am currently checking the questions box. I don't see any questions there yet. Please feel free to type away. I'm also checking if anybody has raised their hand. But for the moment, I see no such thing. Please make sure you use this webinar as much as possible to ask questions to our experts and to really clarify anything that wasn't clear to you from either reading the document, what's coming up for UNEP banks in 2020, or from the presentation here. This is really the moment to do it, and so to make sure that you can benefit the best possible from our activities and projects, because we very much look forward to working with you on these issues.
Thanks, Simone, and we'll do a webinar on the biodiversity targeted setting and what's happening in the policy space in March, so also look out for that. And otherwise, thanks everyone for your time.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Liesl. And I think with that, wait, the questions box is okay. It's around the slides. We will resend the slides tomorrow in follow-up to these webinars. So I think with that, let's move on to some very interesting Europe-specific projects that we have going on. I know we have quite a few European members also in this call. Of course, there is a lot happening in Europe these days, very dynamic space around sustainable finance, and especially at European level, the European Commission, European policymakers are really moving quite decisively and swiftly on sustainable finance. And one of our own colleagues here, Elodie Feller, was one of the people who led the development of the famous EU taxonomy, the EU Green Taxonomy. So fantastic to have such an expert with us in-house. And even better, she is leading a project on understanding how the EU taxonomy applies to core banking products. Elodie, over to you. I think you're already on the call.
Hi, Simone. It's Mustafa. I'll be covering for Elodie. Hi, everyone. So this is Mustafa Chowdhury. I am also working with Elodie on this project. Elodie unfortunately can't make it, but I will be providing you an update on the project. Just a quick reminder about the taxonomy. So it was since 2018, the European Commission has been developing a taxonomy for defining environmentally sustainable finance in the EU, and this is part of the broader action plan for driving private finance towards sustainable finance activities that the Commission published in 2018. Just a quick background of why the taxonomy was developed. First, the member states in the EU are keen to mobilize private finance to help achieve climate and environmental goals that it set for itself in 2050. And then secondly, the taxonomy provides a common language across financial markets for what environmentally sustainable means. And thirdly, to the extent possible, it aims to harmonize systems in place. It reduces transaction costs with all the flourishing number of green finance labels and standards. So as Simone mentioned, UNEP has been involved in the technical expert group since 2018. That was developing the taxonomy for the European Commission, and Elodie Feller was part of the technical expert group. So the taxonomy is an environmental performance exercise. The objective is to really provide a list of economic activities across all sectors across the economy that make a substantial contribution to 6 environmental objectives that are aligned in order to achieve the objectives of the EU, but also UNEP in a way. These include climate mitigation, adaptation, protection of water and marine resources, pollution, circular economy and waste management, as well as biodiversity and ecosystems. So the initial release focuses on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the other objectives will be developed in the coming 2 years. So in December, so last month, the European Commission and the EU member states did come to a final agreement on the establishment of the taxonomy in European Union law. So starting in 2021, investors offering investment products in Europe, but corporates as well under the NFRD, which is the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, will be subject to disclosing along the taxonomy, and this includes listed banks and their financial undertakings. So this is of interest to a lot of banks. So in preparation for that, a number of UNEP banks reached out interested to explore how the taxonomy for banking, how to use the taxonomy for banking business lines. So we partnered with the European Banking Federation to launch a working group that is assessing, piloting the extent to which the European Union taxonomy could be applied to core banking products. So the point is to just provide high-level guidelines over how the taxonomy could be applied to core banking products, or whether it can be applied. We'll be developing use cases with the working group, and at the end of the project we'll be issuing recommendations based on the project findings. The working group is composed of 25 banks, 7 banking associations that came in through the European Banking Federation, as well as 5 observers. And in Q4 we are expecting to issue the recommendations, having worked with the working group over the course of the year. We may adjust the timelines in line with the European Commission related taxonomy developments and processes that are still ongoing in 2020. Can we please move on to the next slide? Sorry, previous slide. Thank you. So you can see all the banks who are involved. It is you're focused obviously with this being focused or aligned with the EU taxonomy, and observers also do include the European Commission, European Banking Authority, as well as the PRI, who have a parallel group on testing the taxonomy for investors. So if you do want to find out more about this project, or want to stay in touch, do contact either Elodie or myself.
Thank you very much for that, Mustafa. Much appreciated. Let's cover our second Europe-specific project before we go into questions. And this one is very much around energy efficiency. And I would like our colleague Martin to present on that. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simone. So I'm going to present, as you said, on energy efficiency, finance and investment. Essentially, the way we do our activities on energy efficiency within Europe is in cooperation with the European Commission. So we have a joint project called the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, which contains about 60 financial institutions as well as energy efficiency experts and senior policymakers. And it aims to overcome long-term investment barriers to energy efficiency investment in Europe. It's now recently gone into its third phase and has now, let's say, switched into a quicker gear by establishing a series of new working groups, which I will be talking about later on. So it's operating via a working group structure. That means that the work of EFIC is supported by a consortium of consultants. However, of course, the working group members are expected to do some of the heavy lifting as well. So why do we deal with energy efficiency? Essentially, first of all, when you look at your balance sheets or the average balance sheet composition globally, you can see that 44% of real estate loans are, 44% of balance sheets are actually in real estate. And of course, energy efficiency can be expected to have a major impact not only on the value of real estate, but also actually, and that is an interesting hypothesis that we are pursuing in one of the working groups, have an impact on credit quality. In Europe, we are expecting to have an increase in energy efficiency investment. That also has to do with the fact that the sustainable finance work of the Commission has identified 60% of the investment gap until 2030 for the current targets to be in energy efficiency in real estate. In addition, of course, globally, there's a large investment gap. We need to shift to about 500 billion of investment per year by 2025, and then about 1 trillion by 2050. So it's a growing market. And we can expect in Europe with the Green Deal for Europe investment plan, which aims to catalyze 1 trillion of new investment into climate and energy, to put energy efficiency first, and therefore drive not only an supportive regulation and policy interventions, but also financial interventions such as concessionary finance, guarantees, and project development assistance. So overall, there will be quite a significant amount of financial support available from the Commission in order to realize that 1 trillion by 2030. But of course, energy efficiency also aligns with several sustainable finance trends, which have a large impact on real estate. Paris alignment, when you look at the financed emissions that banks are currently exposed to, you can see that 44% are in real estate. So energy efficiency is a major component of Paris alignment. But there's also ongoing work on as has been previously alluded to, on the sustainable finance taxonomy. So essentially, EFIC provided a input, the DG Energy input into the taxonomy on buildings. And there's also a consideration of a green supporting factor, which has been introduced in China, and which Europe is also considering, which would essentially entail a relaxation of capital adequacy requirements for energy efficient mortgages. However, that would require very robust evidence, robust enough for financial regulators. And for that reason, it is actually important to exchange data on this. And I'll say more about this on the next slide. When you look at the EFIC working groups, can you switch to the next slide, please? So when you look at the EFIC working groups, you see there are 3 new working groups being set up. Each one of them will have about 20 representatives. These working groups will be, as I said, supported by a consortium. They are working group leads, which do most of the heavy lifting. However, of course, it is a working group, so some contributions, some time contribution from members is required. We have launched a call for expressions of interest for this jointly with the Commission. The deadline for this is by Friday this week, which is quite short notice. We understand that. So for financial institutions, if you send your expression of interest by Wednesday next week, that would still be considered. Each working group will have up to 6 meetings, some remotely, some in Brussels, and they deal with 3 important topics. The first one is the financial performance of energy efficient loans, which is looking at, as I mentioned previously, on the contribution of energy efficiency to credit quality. So essentially loan taker quality in mortgage books, but also in unsecured loans. It will also be looking at the impact of energy efficiency on loss given default. So this is something which is interesting to sustainability departments, but also to risk departments. We will also have financial regulators on that working group, as well as energy efficiency experts. So that's the first working group. The second one is looking at best practices in energy efficient financial instruments. So essentially looking at what has worked in the past, which new trends in financing energy efficiency are emerging, and which financial instruments can now be considered established. So that working group is essentially an exchange of best practices, and we expect to have quite a few transactions-related energy efficiency experts on this working group, as well as sustainability teams. And then the final working group that I would like to mention is looking at multiple benefits. So the question, in addition to energy savings, what else does energy efficiency provide? So in terms of, for example, the quality of building occupier well-being, but also macroeconomic development such as economic growth, productivity, and job creation. That working group will be looking at real estate and industry. And with that, I think I finalized my intervention, and of course I'm available for any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that, Martin, and again also to Mustafa. Let's see if we have any questions on these Europe-specific projects. Please feel free to type them into the questions box now or raise your hands. I don't see anything in the questions box for the moment. I'm checking if anybody has raised their hands so we can unmute them. It doesn't look like that for the moment. Yeah, I guess have a deeper look at what's on the slide and what's in the document that was shared, and maybe reach out directly to Mustafa and to Martin to learn more about the projects and make sure, especially for the energy efficiency work, to do that quickly. I'm sure it would be great to still have some of you in the call on board for that. With that, let's move into our last 2 areas that we want to have a quick look at, understanding that we're getting to the end of our time. That's our flagship event for 2020, the Global Roundtable, and also our training offering. So let's start with the flagship event, for which I'm handing over to Mustafa once again. Mustafa.
Thanks, Simone. So just to give you a quick update on our flagship events, we announced a few weeks ago that the UNEP Global Roundtable in 2020 will take place in Mexico City on the 13th and 14th of October. We're very excited to be in Latin America for the Global Roundtable, which takes place every 2 years. This is so in 2019 we had 5 regional roundtables, but the focus for the Global Roundtable will combine all initiatives to present as one on a global scale. If we could move on to the next slide. So on the 13th and 14th of October, we will be focusing on all areas that UNEP covers, but also beyond. So this includes banking, investment, insurance, climate change, ecosystems, biodiversity, positive impact, social issues, fintech, and much more. So we'll go beyond what UNEP covers, but also we will also be highlighting the great work that our members are doing. On the 14th of October, we will also be hosting the UNEP annual general meeting, which UNEP members are all required to attend. So that's the 13th and 14th of October in Mexico City. On the 15th of October, for our banking members, we have something very exciting. We have the Principles for Responsible Banking Day, which will be a full day of principles workshops alongside the Global Roundtable. Again, obviously in Mexico City. I think Simone can maybe elaborate a little bit more about what will be involved in this day for the signatories of the principles. Simone?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mustafa. One of the most important days of your year. So please mark it in your calendars already. The Principles for Responsible Banking full day event, and it will be all about sharing the experiences of all the signatories of the first year of implementing the Principles for Responsible Banking. There will be a lot of learning, both from the various working groups, but also from all the banks that have been on this for a year, that have put out their first reporting, that have tackled various challenges. So this is really the day in the year to learn from all your peers around the world and crack a lot of nuts and challenges you're working on. So really mark that in your calendar. Make sure you join us in Mexico.
Yeah, great. And we'll be sharing information on this over the next couple of weeks when we will open registrations as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mustafa. And let's look at trainings as well, last but not least, quite important. And then after those two, we'll take a very last round of questions. Liesel.
Thanks, Simone. So the main thing is, as UNEP members, you do get a discount on these training courses, and the ones which you can access online are the first three. So environmental social risk analysis, ESRA training, is available online, as well as corporate eco-efficiency, looking more at your internal operations, and climate change risks and opportunities, which really integrates some of the learnings from the early TCFD piloting with the banks, so that you can learn about how to integrate that into your systems. These are all available in English and Spanish. The ESRA course also in French and Chinese. And the other courses, which you can see there on green bonds, sustainable finance, etc., are in-person workshops. So this is more on demand basis, and if we get sponsorship for those. So if you're interested in finding out more, please have a look at our website and get in touch, and we'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa and Liesel. I'm having a last look at the questions box. I don't see any further questions for the moment. I also don't see any raised hands. So given the time, let me send you off with some next steps for you, because of course there are always to-dos and there is always something further coming. So most important to do for you now, contact the relevant working group lead or project lead, either for more information or for letting them know that you want to participate, and of course in the project or initiatives that meet your needs and priorities best. So get on that. We very much look forward to working together with you closely this year. Then also, you've heard Poulain's presentation in the beginning. The working group structure specifically for Principles for Responsible Banking implementation is still in draft. So once that's finalized, we will send you probably end of February an updated version of the what's coming up for UNEP member banks in 2020 that will also include details on all the working groups. So you'll have a full overview at that point in time. And then a heads up. One thing we are doing, quite important, is getting the banking governance and resources fit for delivering on the Principles for Responsible Banking. So there's a big governance reform in preparation, and also a reform of the fees. Of course, this all will happen with your inputs and guidance. So look out for an invitation for a first webinar towards the end of February, where we'll give you an idea of what the draft thinking is and really want to get your inputs and views so they can be duly integrated in how we move forward. With that, thank you very much for taking the time today. We'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with webinar recordings and the slides again, so you can also share with all your colleagues. And once again, do reach out. We look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.